This is Links as Language. My name is David Dylan Thomas. I'm at movie_pundit. And what I basically want to sort of get across here is I want you to start thinking of hyperlinks as a writing tool, the same way you would a metaphor or a comma. And the way I like to do this is, as far as questions go, ask early, ask often. This usually ends up being a really interesting discussion. And where the discussion goes varies from talk to talk. Last year I gave this at bar camp, and we ended up talking about the nature of knowledge in the 21st century. It's just fun stuff. So the first thing I want you to look at are these two sentences. So the sentence on the left doesn't really make much sense. It's actually grammatically incorrect. It's missing a subject. You need to know what this is. Exact same words in the sentence on the right, but somehow, intuitively, it just makes a little more sense. It's just a little more satisfying. And part of the reason is we know we could find out the subject just by clicking on this. And we could know how much coverage just by clicking on this much for coverage. The fact that we know that, even if we don't click on it, tells us something, it communicates something. And it's able to do that simply because it's blue and it's underlined. And the fact that it's blue and it's underlined tells us something. It's a symbol. And it's a symbol that ends up conveying meaning. It actually invents a subject where there is no subject. And whenever you have a symbol that conveys meaning, you have language. So that's kind of what I'm talking about when I say I'm talking about links as language. Now, let me give you another example. Sentence on the left, grammatically fine. It's just very, very boring. I guess I should update my status more often, big deal. Sentence on the right, again, exact same words, but because update my status is hyperlinked, we know there's a promise there. We know that if we click on that, we'll understand why this person is writing this sentence. And this has to do with a very basic concept of setup and payoff. And setup and payoff is nothing new in narrative fiction and any kind of storytelling. I mean, if you think of a mystery novel, all a mystery novel is lots of setup to the payoff. A bunch of clues are laid out for you, and if you can pay very close attention when they reveal who've done it, you'll know in advance. But the payoff is who done it. Here, the payoff is if you click on Update My Status, you'll be sent to a story from the New York Times about a guy who was accused of a crime, and his alibi was his Facebook status said he was somewhere else, and he got off. And why he couldn't have updated his status from the crime scene, I don't know. But at the time, Facebook was relatively new, so they just took his word for it. But that's the payoff. You know, this has now given us, this one little sentence that means nothing has now given us this whole story. So let's go back. Let's talk a little more about setup and payoff and go back to that first example. So where this comes from is way back when Da Vinci Code came out at the Cannes Film Festival. It premiered there before it showed anywhere else. And it bombed. The critics hated it. And this became a big news story all of a sudden. Not just the movie blogs were reporting on this, but AP and Reuters and Yahoo, all these different places were reporting on it. And I thought, I love movies as much as the next guy, but it seems kind of a big deal. So I put up this post on my blog saying, does this really deserve this much in coverage? So there's several different kinds of payoff going on here. The obvious one is if you click on this, it'll take you to one of those stories, so you'll know what this is. And then you have this much in coverage, which the payoff is how much coverage, but it goes a little further than that. So if you think about a link, in this context, all a link is a citation. And it's a citation that's kind of instant, though. I like to think of links as footnotes on a crack. So I'm not just telling you that there's evidence. Oh yeah, on this date, somebody on the New York Times wrote the story. No, I'm giving you the story. This isn't just the citation, it's the actual evidence. So that's kind of operating on a whole new level. When people talk about big change, they like to talk about differences in degree versus differences in kind. I like to think of this, if you compare it to footnotes or citations, to be a difference in kind. We've gone to something completely different. Because the thing I'm linking to now is so close, it's so readily available. It isn't just, oh, you see the footnote, and if I went to a library somewhere, I could find that thing that you're talking about. No, it's right here. It might as well be right next to the thing you're looking at. That is a whole different degree, or sorry, a whole different kind. And that comes with a whole bunch of implications for how we read. So, from a writing standpoint, talking about setup and payoff and this kind of instant payoff, what you can sort of start to do is to think of links as promises, or as a door with a sign on it. So you think about, you go to different restaurants, and different restaurants have different ways that they signify the men's room and the women's room. And you can do sort of very straightforward linking. Think of, if I just said, here's a report from the New York Times, and that's hyperlinked. You go there, and there's a report from the New York Times. Very simple, straightforward. And then some restaurants like to be cute, and they'll have like a cowboy hat for one and a dress for another, and so you can be a little coy with your links. I mean, this guy, I'm being a little coy with my links here. Then you can completely upset the expectation altogether. Everybody knows what a Rickroll is. Rickroll would not work if it weren't for the fact that you know what it means when you see blue underlined. Here's the latest video from that band you like. Because you know what to expect there, that I don't have to tell you, the Rickroll works. It's upsetting the expectation. So when you're thinking about what kind of a writing tool a hyperlink is, it's that kind of a tool. It's a setup and payoff tool. So because we have this understanding, I believe there's three big ways that hyperlinks not just changing the way we write, but changing the way we actually read. So the session is called, how to write in 3D. And what I mean by that is, if you think about a typical text as sort of, here it is in 2D, going from here to here, writing kind of gives you this, using hyperlinks gives you this kind of z-axis where you can go through the page onto something else. In fact, onto an entire constellation of other things. So because you have that now, there's sort of three different things that happen with your reading. So one thing that's changed is our expectations. We know what it means when we see something that's blue and underlined. We just know. And what's really interesting to me about that is it didn't take a lot of work for that to happen. Tim Berners-Lee did not have to sit us all down and say, okay, you're going to see some blue words and they're underlined. What you do is you click on them and it takes you to this, we just sort of grew up with it. There was no big public service campaign, announcement campaign. We just kind of got it. And now that we've got it, there are all these expectations that come along with it. And as a writer, you kind of have to be aware of them. So one of the things that can happen is, I know personally when I click on a link, and let's say I'm using Firefox, and the link is going to a PDF, well in Firefox I'll actually open up your Adobe and it'll open up, and it's annoying as hell to me. I wish I had known before I clicked on it that it was a PDF, and some people will actually put in parentheses PDF next to it, because they know what I'm expecting, and they don't want to upset that expectation. Another thing, CNN doesn't do this anymore, but originally, you go to CNN and see their headlines, and you see a really cool headline, and you click on it, and it'll take you to a video, which is good for them, they have video, but I'm standing in line at Dunkin' Donuts on my mobile phone, I can't watch a video right now. So one thing they started doing was they had a little video icon next to the links that would take you to video. So it's about managing those expectations. So one of the things, though, that expectation being built in affords you is this ability to be elegant. You don't have to be obvious. So can anyone guess what the two most useless words that you could possibly hyperlink are? That's absolutely correct. This is almost, at this point in our history with hyperlinks, this is almost meta. This is almost like having a stop sign that says, this is a stop sign. Now, what's interesting, at this point, a lot of times when I give this lecture at this point, someone will point out very rightly that if you have some kind of, let's say, service-oriented website or business-oriented website where you need a call to action, you need somebody to actually do something or buy something, if you A/B test this sort of thing, click here will win every single time. And I'm here to tell you absolutely true. I will not argue that. And a lot of what I'm talking about today has more to do with content-based writing, like blogs, than it has to do with service-based, you're designing the website for fully car share type of websites. So I'll put it this way. Click here has its place, but it is not necessarily in the most artistic of writing. So I'll give you an example of how the sort of alternatives you have. So if I'm writing about, blogging about this article I read in the New York Times, what I can very easily say is, David Leonard said in his recent article for the New York Times that blah, blah, blah. And it's very elegant. And what's nice about this is it doesn't interrupt the flow. You could print this page, and obviously now you can't click on the link, but it has its integrity. I still know that in his recent article for the New York Times, that's fine. If I want to find it, I can go look for it. But it's there. You haven't interrupted the flow. This other alternative of click here to read that article is if no one knows what blue and underlined means. Now you've interrupted the flow. This won't make any sense if I print it out. And even if I am reading it online, I have to stumble over that before I get to the next thing. And not for nothing, but this is much better SEO. Not for you, mind you, but for the New York Times. But pay it forward, help them out. So the second thing that really changes when you're reading now that you have hyperlinks is your options. So it used to be that you really only had two options as a reader. Read or stop reading. That's pretty much it. Now with hyperlinks, we have this weird new third option. There's read, there's stop reading, and then there's explore. Because when I click on that link, I can go to the New York Times, and I can look around, I can maybe go to somewhere else in the New York Times, and maybe I can come back, and then maybe I can go back out again. I have this weird sort of journey that I can take that I couldn't really take if I was just actually holding the New York Times. And you as a writer can kind of craft that journey. Now even before we got to the internet, roughly about the same time, there was a book series, there was a print form of this kind of journey. Does anybody know what I'm talking about? Absolutely. So if you, like me, grew up in the 80s, you had access to this wonderful geeky thing called Choose Your Own Adventure, which would be stories about, pirates or fantasy or sci-fi, and it was always in the second person, and you wake up and you go here, and you can either go down the corridor or open up the door. And if you open up the door, turn to page 72, and if you go down the corridor, turn to page 13. And I would go down the corridor, turn to page 13, oh, you died. So you would say, oh, no, I didn't turn to page 13, I turned to page 72. But this was sort of the beginning of taking a text form and saying, okay, we don't have to go in one direction. We can actually go in multiple directions. So this becomes very important when you talk about this third way, and I think the most interesting way that we've changed reading with hyperlinks. And that is this idea of the reader as a gamer. And here's what I mean by that. Will Wright gave a talk in 2007 at South by Southwest. He was introducing sport. And one of the things he talked about was the difference between game narratives and film narratives. Now, film narratives are very linear. You go from point A to point B to point C, movie's over. Game narrative, you go from point A to point B to point L, you die. You come back to point A, go to point Z, go to point D, go back to point Z because you saved your game, start over again, and on and on and on. And what's happening is instead of going in this straight line, you're actually starting to explore a game space. You're mapping it all out. Now, if you were to take that same world and tell a movie about it, you would just go straight through, as if on a train track. You wouldn't see all this other stuff. But when you're dealing with a game space, you're seeing this entire world. It's a very different kind of journey. And as a way of illustration, he said there's one movie he thought did a really good job of explaining a game space. Can anyone guess what that movie is? Clue. What's that? Clue's actually a really good start at that, at the end, because it was sort of giving you these other options. What's that? Run Lola Run is a very good example because she actually learns from each iteration of the story.
Groundhog's Day?
That's the one he gave. Groundhog Day is a perfect example because he always starts at the same point and he goes through the same space, but each time he goes through that day, he makes different decisions, and the different decisions show him different spaces. And he actually starts to learn from those decisions until he gets to the point where he can basically game the system and make the day go the way he wants it to. But he's exploring this game space. Another recent example, if you want to check it out, is Source Code. Very, very, very good example of that. So the way this sort of relates to hyperlinks is if you were to look at a piece of print journalism, or any kind of print, that is more like the movie narrative. You're going from point A to point B. If you look at something that has hyperlinks, something you're reading online, it has the opportunity to be a lot more like a game space, where you can go through, and like I said, you can take a link, go somewhere else, maybe move around some, then come back, then go to another destination. But because that piece of writing isn't just this one piece of writing anymore, it exists in relation to all these other things, you're now part of that game space. And as a writer, you're not just a writer anymore, you're kind of a game designer. And really, not exactly a game designer, you're even more of an interaction designer. Now this shouldn't actually be anything new. As a writer, you've always been an interaction designer. The metaphors that you choose, the adjectives that you choose, what information you choose to reveal and when you choose to reveal it, that's all influencing the interaction that your reader is going to have with your work. Now we're just taking that one step further and saying, okay, now I'm giving you opportunities to leave this space and look at something else in relation to the thing I'm writing. And whether or not you go there is your choice. And it's a different way to actually think about your relationship to your reader. So what I kind of want to give you here is a case study. To sort of say, okay, well, how can we actually use these things to improve our writing? What's a best practice? What's an example of a good use of that tool? So if I actually click here, let's see if this works. Okay, that's gigantic. All right, I'm going to leave it for a minute. It might actually get small again, but I'll start to describe this to you. So what I'm going to show you here is how you can use hyperlinks to build structure and to illustrate a point. So this isn't getting any smaller. Let me see if it'll scroll down at all. No? All right. So this is an article by Audrey Grabe on a website called Eager, a tech blog, and what she's basically doing, she's writing about, this is back in 2006, she's writing about Canon's Rebel line of cameras and how it's evolved over the years. And one of the things she points out is that, so you can see right here, Andre Agassi used to pitch for Canon. And so, most importantly, Andre Agassi, circa 1990, and circa 1990 is hyperlinked, had a Canon Rebel. Now, one sort of really important rule of thumb here, it's kind of nice, is you could read this whole thing and never click on any of the links, and it's still a nice little piece of writing. However, it's richer if you actually do. So if you talk about setup and payoff, if you actually do click on circa 1990, you get this nice little gift. You get to see Andre Agassi in full-on mullet pitching for the Canon Rebel. It's this wonderful, wonderful artifact from the 90s. So that's her pitch, that's her setup, and she's giving you this payoff of what it was like then, illustrating it, not just showing it to you. And then at the end of the article, she's already sort of established how the line has evolved over the years. And she has this line, "It's been a great show watching these two hotshots come of age." And again, you could read that, it makes sense, you could go on, don't need to click on it. But if you do click on it, you get another little gift. So now we see respectable Andre Agassi, no more mullet, he has this nice charity for children, and all is well with the world. And what she's kind of done here is, she's kind of created this little story with a beginning and an end. Here is Andre Agassi 1990, here's Andre Agassi now. Here's the Canon Rebel line then, here's the Canon Rebel line now. And she could have just as easily said, okay, Andre Agassi used to be really kind of silly and pitch for this camera, and now he's really respectable, and the camera line is evolved like that as well. She just put that in a sentence. But what she's done here is actually demonstrated that, shown it to you. When you talk about show, not tell as a fundamental rule of writing, she's shown it to you using a piece of video and a website. So use that to illustrate that same point more vividly. And what's even more interesting than that, I think, is that you actually had to take action to get that. That was not a guarantee that you were going to get that from the way she wrote it. But you had the option of finding that hidden narrative that was illustrating that point, if you wanted to. So it's a different level of writing in terms of deciding, okay, how much of this am I going to reveal? How much of this am I going to show? How much of a risk am I going to take that this neat little trick I've pulled isn't even going to be discovered? Or how enticing can I make this link so that it does get discovered? These are all these new decisions as a writer you have the opportunity to make that you really never had before. But this, I think, is a good example of how you can use hyperlinks to relate to the things that are all out on the web, bring them into the context of what you're doing. Let's get back. So I think Alex Hillman actually said it better than I just did. The hyperlinks of 1999 were the chief source of interactivity on the web. They were what got me from over here to over there. Okay, again, that linear journey. In 2009, hyperlinks are more than a pointer. Hyperlinks are inclusionary. Their purpose is to point to something else and include it in the given context. And that's just what she did there. And that's how I want you to start thinking of your writing if you're writing online, is that it doesn't exist alone. It exists in a constellation of other things. So another thing you start to be able to think about is, again, this is kind of random, but it shows you what new things you have to think about as a writer. So I used to do a movie blog where I would talk about what movies were coming out that weekend. So obviously, I would link a lot to the IMDb, movie titles linked to the IMDb. And one day in the comments, someone asked me, would you mind linking to the Wikipedia page instead? And it wasn't really clear why, and then he sort of explained why. So this has to do with URLs. The URL for the IMDb page of any movie is IMDb / some big complicated number. IMDb, or the URL for a Wikipedia page for a movie is Wikipedia / the name of the movie. And what he wanted, because he knew that for his browser, and a lot of browsers, if you roll over the link, it'll show you the URL of where it's going. He wanted to know where the link was taking him. So little things like that. would never think of if you're writing something purely for print. It would never even come to your mind. But now you have another decision to make as a writer. Do you want to be a little coy about that and not reveal it right away? Do you want to give that away right away? I actually have on my blog a sort of quote generator. It's a WordPress plugin, and it just generates all these movie quotes and links back to the IMDb page for the quote. And I like to leave that as the IMDb page because I like not knowing if someone sees a quote and it's like, oh, that's a funny quote, I wonder where it's from. I like the fact that they have to go to the IMDb to see that it's not going to be revealed to them right there on the page. That's just my own personal artistic choice. But these are the decisions you start to be able to make. So why talk about this? Why this is even important in the first place? So one reason I think it's a good thing to talk about is what I like to call the social history of the blog. So way back when, before blogs were very popular, if you saw a really cool link, you would typically email it to your friends. You saw this really cool link, you get the email, and on and on and on. And eventually some people started to figure out, well, instead of sending all these emails out, why don't I just put all the links in one place and everyone can just come there. And so you get things invented like Boing Boing, which to this day is still a collection of cool things, right? Evolved from a zine into that. Around the same time, as blogs were evolving, they were evolving as a personal journal, as something, a way to write about your passion. And it all got kind of mixed in with using these links to express those passions. So that style of writing really started to evolve, with being able to use hyperlinks artistically in your writing, started to evolve with blogs. So it's kind of central, I think, to the DNA of what a lot of online writing is. And one of the other reasons I think it's important is because that is kind of what makes online writing online writing. I went to a panel once talking about how to write online, and had sort of good points to make about brevity and knowing your audience, but not one point did they talk about hyperlinks, which didn't seem insane because, well, where else? What else makes writing online completely unique from any other? When I wrote my first blog back in 2002, I started a blog called Confessions of an Indie Filmmaker. And I put up my first post, I told everybody about it, and my best friend wrote me back and said, this is nice, where are all the hyperlinks? And I just, like, and then I realized, oh yeah, I can do that. I have this whole opportunity here, I'm just completely squandering. And I really haven't seen the art, as it were, evolve at all since then. I mean, the examples I'm using are from like 2006 and 2004. And it's because I really haven't found a ton of other great examples. I mean, there are some people out there who are doing really good work with this, but you haven't seen it evolve the way you've seen other art forms evolve. And we'll get into a minute about why that might be, but that's another part of the reason I think it's important to start talking about. I mean, if you look at the New York Times, they do a fairly good job of putting links in there, but there's no real sort of artistic thoughtfulness to it.
Well, I was thinking, as soon as you mentioned this, I was thinking of Wikipedia the whole time. Because if you're doing college essays, you're not allowed to use Wikipedia, but Wikipedia has a bunch of links of where they got their sources from. But like a reason why I think some people don't want to use links is because there are websites that they might have links that look like it's going into the topic you read about, but it's just advertisement. So I think people you kind of get desensitized, and we don't want to deal with it a lot of times.
Well, this goes right back to the whole thing about setting up expectations. One of the other examples is if you ever see a green word with two green underlines, that's a cue right away. Absolutely stay away. Do not click on the link. We're just trained to know that. And that's sort of, it's that kind of stuff that ruins it for the rest of us. But no, I think that's a perfectly valid point. And it's good that you bring up Wikipedia, because one of the other reasons I think it's kind of important. So this has to do with knowledge. So what you're seeing here, up top are two neurons. And where this is all coming from is the idea that the web is kind of like one big brain, and more links makes it smarter. Sometimes dumber, but on the whole smarter. And I sort of had this idea a while ago, and I ran it by my wife, who's a neuropsychologist, expecting her to completely shoot it down. But she said, actually, there might be something there. So she actually found this, made these slides here. So what you see up top are two neurons, and one is healthier than the other. The one on the right is healthier. And what you see coming out of the neurons are called dendrites. It's called dendritic branching. So on the left you have unhealthy dendritic branching, on the right you have healthy dendritic branching. And what those dendrites do is they either receive information or they shoot out information. So you can think of them as inbound links or outgoing links. Usually only really do one or the other. And the more they have, the healthier they tend to be. What you see here is a graph someone made, a graphical representation of about 250 government websites that happen to be linked together. And the resemblance is kind of deliberate there. I think that you can sort of see, again, here are inbound links and outbound links, and the really healthy ones tend to have a lot of them. And this works not just in a sort of, oh, the graphs are similar kind of way. It actually kind of works in a way the brain works kind of way. So I'll give you a very, very quick lesson in the current thinking on how memory works. So the current thinking is that memory works based on something called long-term potentiation. That basically means is, if a synapse fires, and that synapse is firing and it's helping you remember a lollipop you had when you were 5, the more that fires, the more likely it is to fire again later. So that memory is going to be really, really good. If you think about the way links work, if you think about the way Google works, Google rewards inbound links. And what they're basically saying is, in effect, the more people that click on that link to get to that site, the higher it'll rank in Google. The higher it ranks in Google, the more people will click on it. So the more people that click on it, the more people that fire that synapse, the more likely it is to get clicked on again. So even operationally, it kind of works the same way. So links actually become very important to the health, if you will, of the web. So one of the things I sort of wonder about this is, where can this all be going? What's the sort of future of all of this? In different media, for example. Obviously this is something suited to the web, but what are we seeing in print? Has anyone read the Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde? Anyone? Okay, how many footnotes are in that book? It has basically, every page basically is text and then almost like half of a footnote, half of it is footnotes. And it's almost as if you wanted, I think, to make the whole thing just full of hyperlinks that would take you to these other pages, because it's practically another page to see these things. But I wonder how much that actually comes from a generation that's kind of used to that idea of a text being related to other texts as opposed to being, I'm going to tell this one straight story. Other places, you'll see, this has actually been around for a while, the technology where you can be watching a video and you can click on Don Draper's clothes and go to the website to buy that piece of clothing from somewhere. It never really took off because so far the implementation has been pretty crappy. But if the idea of even doing it has already been out there. So there's already ways to sort of start incorporating that. In art or photography, Flickr comments have been around forever. That's nothing new. What's really interesting to me now is sort of seeing this pop up in real life. So you have augmented reality, which is kind of like that because you're creating a layer over things. And it's only a matter of time before those layers start to become clickable, which would really be it. But in a way, you've got that already with QR codes. Does everyone here know what a QR code is? Okay. So a QR code is basically a way of hyperlinking life. You can be walking around and see a QR code, hold up your smartphone, and bam, now I'm going from life to some website. So we're turning, sorry.
Sorry, it's another comment. I didn't
Sure.
I was just wondering, when we talk about long-term potentiation in linking on the web, what would that do to, like, over the course of a written work, a piece of fiction that utilizes hyperlinking and things? If you collected the data from each reader's experience with that, what did they link through to? What did they click through to? And what, say, let's go back to the Choose Your Own Adventure game or whatever. What places in the game space do people flock to? And how could that later change that work? Or, how could that feed back into, like when you start getting those centers of gravity, which you do in any human system, right? What does it mean about the work, or what does it mean about? It's kind of an open question.
Well, no, I mean, it's a really interesting, because what it reminds me of is a real world application of what you're talking about. So, and again, it goes back to gaming. So there is a game, I forget what it's called, but it's kind of like Chore Wars. And the basic idea is that it's set up for an office environment. And whenever you ask someone in the office to do a favor, like make a copy, whatever, they rack up points by doing that favor for you. And what they found out was, they could find out who the most valuable people in the office were by seeing who got asked to do the most stuff. So there's all sorts of valuable data in tracing those kind of links and seeing where people click. So you're right, it does sort of show you where the centers of gravity are in a work that is somehow hyperlinked. And I think it would be very interesting to see how you could actually feed that back and start to alter the work based on how people are using it. I think that's a really interesting idea. So another place, and this just popped up the last time I gave this talk. I was at PodCamp Philly and I was talking about this, and someone came up to me afterwards and said, I'm going to try doing hyperlinks in poetry. And I thought that was a great idea. It never even occurred to me because I'm used to thinking of poems as these sort of self-contained things that even if they're referencing something else, they're sort of meant to stand on their own, but there's absolutely no reason you couldn't have a poem that did that. So I think there's a lot of potential there. Another thing that we sort of have to start thinking about, already have to start thinking about, is a problem that comes up with hyperlinks that really doesn't come up anywhere else in writing. And that is this idea that if I link to something, it might not be there at all. And this is, we could do a whole session on the nightmare of digital archiving, but it's related to that. So that first slide I showed you of all those news stories about the Cannes Film Festival, those are all new. The first time I wrote that post, all of those links within about 6 months or so were gone. I found out very quickly that Yahoo, at the time anyway, did not archive their links. They did not have permalinks. So all of a sudden there's this new problem we have as writers that really never existed before, which is the idea that the thing that is a part of your work might actually become obsolete at some point, and at some point sooner than you think. So again, it's this interesting dynamic we now have to work with.
Have you seen anybody acknowledging that and taking care of that? Because still, I'll go out there and go read an old article from 3 or 4 years ago, and things aren't there, it just goes to a dead page. Have you seen anywhere where they're trying to acknowledge that, where that piece of work might somehow loop or find a replacement article or something like that out there?
Almost never. The only time I've ever seen anyone sort of acknowledge, okay, that link is dead, like do an update, that link is dead, now go here, is if it's something very, very fresh.
Okay.
I linked to something and somebody else pulled it down, so here's an archived page or something like that. Usually, and this is actually kind of, I think, the biggest hurdle for all digital archiving is laziness, basically. Or not even laziness, just resources. And this is a problem I had to deal with. I used to work for a digital publishing company, and we were revamping all of our websites, and we had archives that went back lots and lots of years, and it was going to be extremely expensive to update all of them, and so we had to make a cost benefit decision. This is where the cutoff is. Anything from before, and it wasn't even very far back, it was like 2002. Anything before that, tough. We have it on disk, and if someone really wants it, we can get it from that way, but it's just not going to be available anymore. People worry so much about, oh, this thing's on Facebook, and later I'm going to go for a job interview, and someone's going to look at it, and it's going to be a problem. Maybe, but the much bigger problem is 10 years from now, 20 years from now, all of that stuff might not even be accessible anymore. So you have another?
No,
Oh,
I'm sorry, I was sitting over here.
Well, I wonder how you felt about how some of these media, that's the point of them, is that they're meant to be ephemeral and that you're meant to not be able to have, not even not to have access to them, but they're not going to mean anything in 6 months, 6 days, whatever it is.
I mean, it would be nice to, so if that's sort of the stated intention, I think that's a great thing. And I think you're actually going to start to see more and more of that. So, this idea of things lasting forever, we're starting to see people sort of approach that differently. I mean, what I'm actually thinking of is there's these restaurants now in New York that are like pop-up restaurants. They only exist for like 6 months or a year. And sort of part of their appeal is that they're not going to last very long. And a lot of people now, when they're building websites, they're thinking in terms of, oh, we need to create this thing that's going to last forever. But a lot of people are starting web projects now that are meant to have sort of built-in deadlines. I mean, there was a guy who was tweeting the entire Revolutionary War on day-by-day basis. So if it's, if today is, October or November, October 22nd. Okay, on October 22nd, where he is in that timeline, this happened. Then he'd tweet that. And it's just a really interesting thing, but it has a built-in deadline. He's not going to keep that going forever. War lasted however many years, that's when it's going to end. So I think when that's the stated intention, that can actually be a very powerful thing. But I don't think anyone's thinking, oh, well, Facebook is only going to be around for another couple of years. I'll go ahead and upload that. I think people are sort of expecting it to be there forever, and I really don't know how true that's going to be, or sort of in what form. I mean, I think Facebook has a better chance than anybody because they've got the money and the resources to archive things well. And Twitter, for example, has the Library of Congress on their side archiving their stuff. But, there's a big, long tail of other stuff that I don't know is really going to make it. I'm sorry.
Well, about the Facebook and that, like, you said attention to detail, sometimes it's laziness.
Mm-hmm.
What some people do, like, if you have, like, links to other sites, if you have the attention to detail, you can maybe, like, pre-prepare, like, for when it does go up. So, like, you have, like, a PHP code or something that, like, if this link is dead, it'll go to, like, this picture. And Facebook about, like, if you're drinking with your buddies and you don't want your employer, they've, like, updated Facebook so much that you can, like, block things off, so that way you can have, like, your mom or your grandma or your employer go on there, and they'll never see any of that stuff. You just have to go to the privacy and the limitation links.
Yeah. Facebook, I mean, no, sorry.
Sorry, wait.
I was going to say, Facebook's been very good about, like, updating that stuff. They've not been very good about letting people know or making it easy to get to.
Timeline coming out for
Yeah.
developers.
There you go.
Facebook doesn't want people to do that. I mean, that's not, Zuckerberg's view of the world is everything open, share everything, and the world will be better. So that's a huge fight, right? Like I mean, that was Google Plus, is different in that that's how you're friends with somebody. You're friends with somebody because they're a member of one of your social circles or whatever. So that stuff, that's a big fight.
And then this is kind of a sidetrack, but I think it's really important, is what that speaks to is the power of defaults. There was an article that recently came out talking about the way file managers work and this sort of idea of decision fatigue. Did anybody read that? It's basically the idea that the more decisions you have to make during the day, you actually have sort of a mechanism in your brain that will get worn out. And they actually looked at this and saw that people who were up for parole, if they got their case early in the day, they were much more likely to get parole than if they had it later in the day when the judge was tired. Because when you're tired, you want to make the safest decision possible, and the safest decision possible with parole is leave him in jail. So there is a certain decision fatigue that sets in, and it sets in with web design too, I'm convinced. If the default setting for Facebook is everyone can see everything, unless I'm really motivated, I'm not going to change it. If, on the other hand, with Google+, the entire idea is that I can't even set it up until I've decided who is going to see what, then that's the decision I'm going to make. It's nothing to do with links, but I just think it's really interesting.
So one thing that I've thought about with online writing is really the transitions and the interruptions. So it's the footnotes versus endnotes issue of whether you want people to just jump to the back. Have you given much thought to that?
I mean, this is where you really start getting to crap today. I mean, and this is what I want to see get developed. I want to see people start coming up with interesting solutions to that exact same problem. I think a lot of it does start to have to do with how you're crafting. So one of the questions sometimes get is, okay, well, what words do I hyperlink? Do you hyperlink all of, the New York Times, whatever? And then how do I craft those words? And how do I do it in such a way that I'm going to want to come back? I mean, if you look at the example I gave you,
It's opening up a new tab.
it opens up a new tab, and it takes me somewhere else, but it takes me somewhere else in a way that I want to go back. It's like, okay, that's really neat, Andre Agassi. Okay, where were we? Because I'm sort of in the middle of a thought there. I want to get back and see how Andre Agassi comes into the picture. And then at the end, again, okay, I see Andre Agassi. Oh, I see what you did there. Okay, now I want to see how this ends. It does it in a way that makes me want to return to the reason I clicked on the link in the first place.
Right.
So when you're doing stuff like that, then it sort of makes sense to keep it kind of all in one place. But there are plenty of places that sort of have a policy of, okay, all the links are going to be at the end. Like, I will actually footnote, you'll see, I don't know if it's Clay Shirky or it's sort of one of the big sort of web gurus kind of does this in the writing. I find it very surprising given how website they were, but they would use footnotes. They would not hyperlink the words that are footnotes that take you to the bottom if you wanted to read the article there. And I think the intention may have very, very well been this idea that I don't want to interrupt the flow. I want you to have access to this information, but I don't want you to stop reading to do it. I want you to get to it later.
One thing that I've tried is borrowing from magazines and using sidebars. But again, that's sidebars with separate content that may then link out.
Well, I mean, links are almost a web way of dealing with that. Because one of the things about, okay, so they talked to, I forget which founder of Boing Boing, but one of the founders of Boing Boing, and said, okay, is there anything you miss about, when Boing Boing was a zine? And he said, yeah, graphic design. You cannot do graphic design on the web like you do in a magazine. We're still not quite there yet. And certainly, we're not at the point where you can do it in a sort of commoditized way that you have like on Water or WordPress. You can't. You can make it nice. It's easier to make it nice, but you can't make it beautiful unless you're really, 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 really good. And things like sidebars. It's interesting. So I've subscribed to the Hollywood Reporter digital edition, and I get emails every day with news stories in them, and I read those. But I still like to open up the digital edition just because I like seeing the layout, and I like seeing the insets. I mean, it's a different solution to the same problem of related information. And it's and it's pleasing in a different way. But I think that's absolutely right. Yeah. So I should probably wrap up. But okay, 2 quick points. One thing I kind of worry about is Twitter going to kill the art of the link? Because if you think about it, the one thing I would pay for on Twitter is to be able to hyperlink words instead of having to put a bit.ly URL at the end. But I wonder if you're sort of raising a whole generation of people who aren't going to know how to do that because they're used to communicating in that way and separating the link from the words. And the same concern kind of comes up with apps. Apps, the appeal to corporations is apps are a walled garden. It's a way to get people to pay for stuff that they used to get for free on the web. As a result, you're kind of disincentivized from doing links in apps because that's going to take you from the paid part to the web where everything is free. So again, there's sort of reasons now that it's actually going to be kind of hard for this art to develop. So to wrap it all up, and if anyone wants to continue to talk about this at lunch, I'm absolutely up for it. I went to the British Museum earlier this year. And British Museum has stuff from every part of the world, from every part of time. And no matter where I went, there was pottery and vases. And it occurred to me that the history of the world is basically us putting stuff in other stuff. I mean, that's what we do. Occasionally we fight, occasionally have wars, it's about this much of it, but this much of it is putting stuff in other stuff. And then it occurred to me that the web is the ultimate putting stuff in other stuff. And what I hope you take away from this is, instead of just thinking of the web as a place to put your stuff, think of the web as a place to relate your stuff to other stuff. That's it. Thanks.